We're going to think about describing your personal connection to Israel.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Rabbi Sasonkin from Chestnut. I come out of Akron. And when I think about Israel, and thank you all for joining tonight, and support of Israel and support of trying to hear more about your connection with Israel, I think for me personally, when I get my family, I have a lot of deep connection with Israel, and for many reasons. I've been to Israel many times. I've also studied in Israel for a year. I went to camps in Israel. So I've been there. You feel it every time you step foot. You know, people like to, when you get to Israel, some people like to kiss the ground because it's the Holy Land. It's very special going to Israel. And I think anyone who's been to Israel, and I see many of you here have been, there's always something unique about just when you get off that plane and you just feel a certain vibe there. There's something special, a feeling in the air you get. And then when you go to the places that have more of the, deep connections from our roots, from our ancestors, you really feel that so strongly. But I think for me also, where it gets also very personal, is that my family's from Israel, or some of my family. My father, as many of you knew, was born in Israel and was raised there until he was 17 when he came to study here in the United States. My grandfather, he came to Israel at 12 years old, my father's father. He was born in Russia, and he was orphaned for both his parents at a young age, 8 years old, killed by the Soviets for being Jewish. And there was an organization helping young Jewish children, and he ended up going to Israel at age 12. And there he was raised, and my grandfather was a Chabad emissary of the Rabbi in a little moshav in Israel, Moshav Avital. And he also served in the army, and he was a reservist in the army, and he served in the 6-Day War, in the Yom Kippur War. And he was in the Sinai by the Suez Canal during the Yom Kippur War. I was talking to during the 6-Day War, I think it was. I was talking to my grandmother the other week. My grandfather unfortunately passed away a few months ago, and I was talking to her, and she told me that during this Yom Kippur War, my dad was probably 8 years old at the time. He was the oldest of the family, and every day, there was not good communication. You had no idea, what was going on, when they were coming home, or anything like that. And so he said the kids would always wait, by the edge of town to see if my grandfather was coming home. And he finally arrived home just the day of Sukkot. Sukkot is the holiday right a few days after Yom Kippur. And on the day preceding the holiday, like that night was the holiday, he comes home finally, and he said that they ended up eating matzah, even though Pesach was only half a year later, because the bakeries didn't have enough supplies to make bread and challah for the holiday. That's my father's side. My mother's side, my grandfather also, my mother's dad also was raised in Israel, was born in Russia, but raised in Israel. And being that he was similar age to my other grandfather, they were very close friends. And fast forward many years, that's how my parents met, so here I am.
Welcome. I am Rabbi Lipton of Bethel Congregation, which is here, just on the other side of this wall. Come and visit us sometimes. I am delighted to be here with my colleagues, and thank you all for being. It's very interesting that we are here reflecting on our personal connections to Eretz Israel, because I must begin my personal connection with Israel also with my grandfather. But I'm a little older than you are, just a little bit, but my parents were old parents, and my grandparents were also old parents. So I'm going to predate your story by about 75 years. So I'm going to begin the story of my personal connection with Israel with my paternal grandfather, Mendel Lifshitz, who grew up in Eastern Europe, in the Volhynia district of what is now Ukraine, and in a little shtibel called Rokitna, and he was conscripted to the Russian army. But Mendel's lifelong dream was to break the cycle of being an other. And he wanted to live in a land where he could fully express his Jewish identity without fear or without marginalization. So there's no question in my mind that Mendel was inspired by the writings of Herzl. In fact, my grandfather and Herzl were contemporaries. Herzl was only 20 years older than my grandfather. And as a result, he was swept away with this Zionist vision and Zionist dream that we have been talking about as we've been preparing for this evening. That Zionist dream of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. He fled Europe at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and ended up immigrating to this country. He landed in Detroit, Michigan, where there were some relatives that were living at the time. But Mendel's Zionist dream really never left him. It burned deeply within him his entire life. In fact, one of the earliest photos of my grandfather in this country, oh, I just happen to have it here. This is one of the earliest photos. Maybe you'll hold this for me, thanks. This is one of the earliest photos I have of my grandfather in this country. And for those of you who have been in my office, you know that this has a very prominent place over on my cabinet. And I look at it often for inspiration. So what is this? The year is 1910. The city is Detroit, Michigan. This is a meeting of, and by the way, I know you can't see it, you can come up afterwards. This is a meeting of a young group of Jews, Zionist Jews, at a Polate Sion meeting, at a Zionist meeting. And if you notice, they're here in the middle, they're surrounding a picture of Theodor Herzl, who had only passed away 6 years before this meeting. If you notice that there is a banner down at the bottom that says Polate Sion. If you see, there's a couple of Yiddish newspapers that are down at the corner. I wish it were better resolution. I could tell you actually the year that it was. And in the background, and also held by a number of the young people who are here, is a flag. It's a very familiar flag. It's a blue and white flag with a blue mug and David right in the middle. It will become, 38 years later, the flag for Medinat Yisrael. So this is a group of young people who are working tirelessly and trying to fulfill their Zionist dreams. By the way, my grandfather is here. My grandmother is over here. Her sister Minnie is over here. Minnie's first husband is over here. Minnie's second husband is over here. And a whole group of relatives and friends that were all there and gathered, but for one purpose, to help move the ideal of the creation of Medinat Yisrael. You can come look at it. It's a fascinating picture. So, fast forward, well actually slow forward, 15 years later, in 1925, about 15 years after this photo was taken, Mendel decided to act on his passionate dream, and he scraped together enough money while he's working in Detroit to buy some farmland in pre-Israel Palestine. And so he bought some land in Herzliya, which is just a little bit north of Tel Aviv-Yafo, and he planned to grow oranges on that land so he could personally fulfill his dreams. So he and my grandmother and their only child, my father Aaron, who was just about to turn 12 years old in that year, embarked on the long transatlantic journey to their new home. It took them about a month to go across the Atlantic. Little did my grandfather realize at the time that it was going to be 6 or 7 years after he planted the first oranges, the orange seeds, before there was going to be any fruit. So what did he do? He left my grandmother and my father in Palestine, in pre-Israel Palestine. He moved back to the States. He sent them money every month. A cousin took care of the land, and eventually they stayed. My father grew up in Israel, and he was so proud of having been a graduate of the first modern-day Hebrew language high school in the world, in Tel Aviv, Gymnasia Herzliya. And after graduating from Gymnasia Herzliya, he went and became a chemical engineer at a university in France. And he came back to Israel in 1935, and he worked as a chemist at the Dead Sea, at what was then called Palestine Potash Limited at the Dead Sea Works. So although my grandfather and my father and our family returned to the United States in 1940, because my grandmother had become ill, their strong connection to the land continued. My father met my mother at a Zionist meeting. They continued to work tirelessly from afar on behalf of the establishment of the State of Israel, and later together doing all that they could to lend support to the new country in those years. I have to continue the story, a few more notes. My grandfather's passionate connection to Eretz Israel continued literally for the rest of his life to his dying breath. In 1958, when he was in his late 70s, he insisted that he was going to travel back to Israel for Yom Ha'atzmaut, for the 10th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel. His doctors told him he shouldn't do it. His families told him he shouldn't do it. But my grandfather was going to do it. And he did, and he traveled, and unfortunately had a heart attack a couple of days after he got there, and he died 2 days before Yom Ha'atzmaut. He is buried in Kiryat Shaul Cemetery in Tel Aviv, not more than 10 miles away from the orange groves that he planted in Herzliya. So I have to tell you that in our many trips to Israel over the years, I've made a point always to honor his memory and his passion by visiting his grave myself. We've taken our children there as well. So you can see, and I'm sorry that that's taken a little longer than perhaps I planned, but you can see that we each have this incredible personal story. My story with my connection to Israel runs deep. It's really the core of my family's centeredness.
So I'm Rabbi Josh Brown from Temple Israel. It's great to see everybody and great to be here with colleagues and friends. My story is by far the most, I would win the competition if we were to say what's the most personal of the three of us. By far, mine's the most personal because it has nothing to do with anybody except me. My family has no connection to Israel. I'm the first person in my family ever to go to Israel. My family was in the United States before Israel was a state, and we're here in the late 1800s. So I went to Israel for that being said, I very much feel that I reflect the generation of birthright. I think it might end up being called that, as I've only recently heard even this week, that birthright is starting to downshift a little bit. It's not going to be as prominent, and the funding is starting to deplete over the years. So I went on the second ever birthright trip. I was on the second plane ever to take a birthright trip, to my knowledge. Nobody's refuted that yet to me, so I keep saying it.
What year?
I was in 2000. So I think there was a December trip where nobody knew what birthright was, and I went on the May trip. And on that trip, I met my wife. And then years later, I lived in Israel for a year as part of my studies at HUC in rabbinical school. And I met my best friend, who I talk to every day. I mention that because I don't think either of those are a coincidence. I think there is something about being a Jewish person in Israel that is freeing of our identity, that allows us to be more of ourselves than we can be anywhere in the diaspora. And so I don't think, I don't take those, it's always great to travel, and I know many of us have traveled, and we've made great friends traveling to all sorts of places that have nothing to do with who we are. I think there's something different about being in Israel. So I wanted to give just a picture of when I think of Israel as, for me personally, as an example of what I think the difference is. So my favorite Shabbat in Israel, it wasn't every Shabbat, but my favorite Shabbat, I lived in Jerusalem. My favorite Shabbat was Friday afternoon. The city sort of busies up, and then you go do what everybody would probably presume you would do. Maybe you have done this, where you go to one of any number of thousands of shoals that are within 5 miles of each other, and you go to Kabbalat Shabbat services. There's every variety of service you could ever imagine. Some of them are just in people's apartments. You can walk through a street and hear people singing Shabbat everywhere as if it's like the Super Bowl every Friday night. And you go and you pray, and then you go to you walk somewhere to somebody's house for dinner and have a long dinner, and what you see is everybody's doing the same thing in Jerusalem. Everybody's walking to somebody's house for dinner, everybody's singing all night, they're going to the shul, they're going to somebody's house, everybody's on the same schedule. Then I would wake up first thing Shabbat morning. I did not like Shabbat I did not like Shabbat day in Jerusalem. So I would get on a sherut, which is like a shuttle. I would get on the shuttle first thing in the morning, Saturday morning. I'm not a Saturday in shul Jew, believe it or not. I'm a a Friday night in Shilju. Many of you know that very well. So Saturday, I'd hop on the Sherut and I would go to Tel Aviv, which is 45 minutes away, and I'd sit on the beach in Tel Aviv, where everything is the exact opposite of the Shabbat I had the night before, and people are in their bathing suits on the beach, having a beer and a burger, and throwing frisbee, and dancing to music, and the restaurants are open, and everybody's out, and it's a busy day. Nowhere else in the world can you do Friday night like that, like it's the Super Bowl Friday night Shabbat, and then go the next day where being at the beach is also Shabbat. If you were to ask people at the beach, what are you doing here today? They'd say, well, it's Shabbat, I'm at the beach. Israel to me is, when we're in the diaspora, we do our best to live our best Jewish life, and we know it takes work. But for me to be in Israel and do anything Jewish, but Shabbat being perhaps the pinnacle of that, is to live in full color. You get to see Shabbat in flavors that do not exist here. And I'm not saying that Shabbat's not great here. It is. You should come do it if you haven't. But it's just in full color there. And I think that's part of what Israel offers us, are opportunities that don't exist in other places. So for me, I got a wife, I got a best friend, and I got the best Shabbat ever.
Nice.